Welcome back to part 2 of this episode with Ian Bigford. And in this part, we break down the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. This poem fits perfectly in the discussions we have on this podcast because it is about tragedy and adversity and the mindset that you should have so that you can live a resilient and successful life if you live in this way. And the poem is a set of rules for living, how you can ensure you have the right attitude to approach life. And it's the author actually was starved of love and attention and was sent away by his parents, beaten and abused by his foster mother, and a failure at a public school which sought to develop qualities that were completely alien to Kipling. And then later in life, the deaths of his 2 children also affected Kipling deeply. So it's interesting that someone that had been through so many different types of adversity has now put together a poem with skills that you will hear that really it's just so empowering to hear. It's if I can attain these characteristics, these beliefs, these ways of living, then I'll be quite resilient in all areas of my life. Kipling actually turned down a bunch of honors for his work with poetry, but later in 1907 accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature. So, and the funny thing is his popular appeal survives today through other works, and one of those would notably be The Jungle Book from 1894. Kipling is said to have written the poem If, the poem we're going to break down today, with Dr. Leander Starr Jameson in mind. This individual also ventured through high amounts of adversity and was actually one who led 500 of his countrymen in a failed raid against the Boers in southern Africa. The Jameson raid was later considered a major factor in starting the Boer War. So I hope you enjoy this poem. It's one that I'll continue to read, and we even talk about that in this episode, that it's a poem that can remind you how to act. But my favorite thing above all else is that it is a perfect example of Victorian-era stoicism and how we can deal with our emotions and how we have control over our attitude, which will then enable us to be the best we can be. What if we are able to be the best we can be? So this is the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those 2 impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop and build them up with worn out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Well, what if you became all you could be? Which is, I feel like an anxiety-inducing topic right there, is that when we make decisions nowadays, this is no secret. Well, if I don't make this decision, or if I invest in this company, or if I don't go on vacation here, or if I don't take this opportunity, what if I don't become all that I could? And that's anxiety-inducing. And this poem's interesting anyways. I really enjoy it. And I don't know how you found these poems, but just these 3 poems made me want to be like, I need to get into poetry. There's something intrinsic about poetry that when you read it, regardless of the theme or the message in the poem, knowing you read, I don't know if it seems more like art. I don't know what my approach is to it. It's almost, the feeling of going to chapters, when you walk into chapters and you walk through the book aisle, you just feel smart for some reason. It sounds ridiculous, but I don't know what it is about that, but it has that effect on me. When I go to chapters, it feels so good. And I don't know why. Why is that? I don't know. I get that same feeling with this poem.
It's supposed to be the effect of poetry, right? And literature, right? Like my degree was in philosophy, and that's so analytical and cold in a sense. And it's very analytical and scientific in a sense, although it's not. But when you read a good piece of poetry, like, it can make you cry. Okay, straight up, right? It's emotional. It goes straight past you, right to the bottom of you. And so, it's a good poem. There's some good ones on here if anybody wants to check them out. I got into it when I was always into kind of English and stuff, and just realized this is impactful stuff. And this particular one was written right around the First World War. People were hardy, man. They were hardy back then. My gosh, life was so different in 1910 than 2018, and you can really see it in some of these poems. The author of this poem, Kipling, he actually wrote a bunch of really, really good poems, and one of them worth checking out was called Boots. He wrote a lot of poems about the military and things like that, and the sort of grittiness and grind of being a soldier. And this poem Boots is really good, but this poem If is more directed towards just everybody, and I think it's super helpful. That's why I posted it.
Cool. Well, let's break it down.
The way it's kind of written in the first stanza is 2 lines at a time. So if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. I mean, obviously that's a very stoic idea, but what he does in this entire poem is kind of break down ideals of hey, ideally that would be what a person would do. And again, to relate that back to our attitude conversation, it would be very difficult to do any of this without a good attitude. Right. So just keeping that in mind, when you keep your wits about you when everybody else is freaking out and losing their minds, that's a good thing. That's what he's saying. And that's kind of similar to what we were saying about the ability to just kind of step off the line and look around and say, hey, no, like, here's what's going on. Like, don't follow the herd, and just have a objective look at things, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. So another theme in this poem is dichotomies. Like, he basically doesn't plant a flag down and say this is the way to be. He says it's about being this way, but also not forgetting to be that way. And this is a great example of that, where just basically saying trust yourself when you have to make decisions, but also remember that other people can be right. Obviously. Exactly.
So if they don't trust you, then don't be too confident in yourself. There may be something that you could fix as well.
Yeah. And it's and the nice thing about that is it's saying you got to find a balance in the situation, right? Like, what is my knowledge on this? I can't just be overconfident if I haven't practiced or learned or read about this thing and whatever.
Right. If you can wait and not be tired by waiting or being lied about, don't deal in lies.
Yeah. So, I mean, we know about the first line there, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting. I mean, that's, again, a very stoic idea, but it's a very, important idea. I think we in the accelerating pace of society, we struggle with waiting. And I think for what he's saying here is when you're kind of pursuing something that you think is important, don't grow tired from waiting for it. It might take a while for it to come about. Usually good things do.
Right. And if you get tired by waiting, then you can become this.
Being tired by waiting is basically losing your good attitude towards, right?
Exactly. Then you start making decisions maybe you shouldn't or not. Then getting up in the morning becomes harder.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or being lied about, don't deal in lies. I mean, obviously it's just a reminder.
Yeah.
And that's actually a good thing when it comes to being on teams. Sometimes it can get political, right? Where it's like it's about pleasing the coach or the boss, or it's about, whatever, kissing somebody's butt to get ahead, or it's about sounding confident when what you're saying that it is not a value add. There's a lot packed into that idea of like, hey, deal in the truth, deal in what's actually true. And I mean, obviously it's hard to know in some instances what's true, but there are some clear examples where, hey, I could probably deal a little bit more in the truth and a little bit less in the sort of BS that surrounds things sometimes.
Exactly. And just because everyone else is doing it doesn't mean it's the right thing to.
Right. Yeah. So next line, or being hated, don't give way to hating.
Exactly.
Don't judge, don't hate people too much. I mean, focus kind of on what you're doing. Don't,
Right.
And yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. Boom.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that.
Right.
That's almost I like that quote on itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, obviously it's talking about the ego, really. I mean, if you talk too wise, it's again saying that there are limits to these things. It's probably reasonable to look pretty good, and try to look pretty good. But if all you focus on is looking like too good or really, really good, like the best in the whatever, if that becomes your focus, then probably your head's not in the right place. Your attitude's not in the right place. And if you talk too wise, then maybe you're actually just talking to try to sound intelligent. That's a little dig, I think, at academics right there.
At you?
Yeah, at me. It's a little dig at me for sure. It's like, hey, you got these degrees. It's like, don't try to talk in a way that other people can't understand you.
Right,
so
exactly.
Don't try to confuse people with your knowledge or whatever. So I like that line a lot.
Yeah, me too.
Next line.
Yeah, if you can dream and not make dreams your master. So I'm going to go ahead and that's basically saying dream, but don't rely on your dreams in your mind bringing you closer to what you have to do. Yeah. And then saying there's actually work that has to go into this. It's not just a dream that you can hang on.
I think also it's about saying like, hey, dream about things, try to make things come about, but also don't forget that it's important to enjoy the process, not just the end. Right? Mm-hmm. You have to endeavor to have a good attitude toward, like we talked about with the commute. It's like, look, like when I commute into work, I had to walk out in the snow. Most people are wincing and hating the fact that it's snowing because it used to be summer. And it's like, well, look, I don't have a choice. I have to do this commute. I'm going to enjoy it. I'm going to enjoy as much of it as I can. And so when you don't make dreams your master, it forces you to actually also enjoy what you're doing now. And that's, again, a dichotomous balance. It's like, look, you can't not have goals, but you can't just focus on the ends of goals.
Right. You know what? That's almost a reminder. Not almost. That is a reminder I need. I find me personally, like I have these things in my mind, and the excitement of this podcast is one thing happens, and now I have all these other goals. Like, look at the impact it's having. Look at these emails we are receiving. You and I both.
Right. And
this feedback, it makes me think, okay, the end goals. Can be bigger.
Right.
And this is what in my mind it looks like.
Impact more people. And,
yeah, and that gets so exciting. So, but I need to also stop and say, like, look at where. And let's enjoy these little steps on the way to hopefully that dream.
Right.
And I forget that all the time. And I would fully admit that, like, that is totally something.
And it's intuitive when you think about you're on your deathbed and you just wish that you could have appreciated that, say you're a corporate executive, you just wish you could have appreciated the dinners you had with your wife and the conversation and been more present and been more open to joyous occasions, instead of having your head in the game with the long-term gratification of some sort of end goal of retiring at 50 whatever, right? Instead, enjoy the process too. It's like, okay, you don't have everything you want to have, doesn't mean you have to put yourself in prison for it.
Exactly.
So if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, I mean, there's another dig at us academics. The purpose of thinking is to be practical, is what that's saying. It's the purpose of thinking is not to just create more thinking.
Right. Just don't sit and ruminate in thoughts. Think for a purpose.
Fun fact for any listeners that are interested. I mean, this was literally so Francis Bacon largely created the scientific method, which obviously I don't have to talk about how useful that's been. It's a super accurate way of saying when can we actually claim something's knowledge and true. And before that, we had what were called the school of rationalists. And they're exactly what this line's talking about. Another way that people call them is armchair philosophers. And so what these philosophers would do was that they would sit in a chair, shut their eyes, and they thought that by thinking they could discover true facts about facts about reality.
I think that's true with myself sometimes.
So it's actually funny because we often reference these philosophers. Descartes was that. He literally, like his book Meditation, he just sat in his chair and he just thought, and that's where he came up that line, I think therefore I am. That came from him just sitting in a chair and closing his eyes and assuming he knew nothing. Immanuel Kant, he was a rationalist. Spinoza was one. Like there were all sorts of these guys, and it was almost out of the frustration against the sort of the method there that science was born. So it's an interesting kind of story. Okay. Just an aside for people that are curious.
If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same, which we already touched on.
Have you heard of that? I forget. I think it's it might be Eastern, but the tale of the tale of maybe. It's I forget the actual name for it, but it's an interesting one where it's like there's like this guy and he has these horses and like two of them get sick and die. And then everybody comes up to him. He says, "Oh, that's a travesty. How horrible is that?" And then he just looks at them. He says, "Maybe." And then he ends up taking that, realizing that, those, like he had to cross a path that could only take one. And so it was good that he had one horse. And then everybody's like, "That's great. Like, what a great coincidence." He looks at him and he says, "Maybe." That's what this is saying. It's saying that we don't know what triumph and disaster truthfully is in many certain circumstances. Your injury is a great example of that, where it caused a whole cascade of great things for you, and your injury probably built mental strength you wouldn't have otherwise built, and understanding your own mind, connections, and all sorts of cool stuff.
Well, it's even like John, the thing that came to mind for me was John Young, who we recently had on, and someone said to him, "Does your son suffer from dwarfism as well?" And he said, "Well, that's such an interesting word you chose. Does he suffer as well?" And he said, "I don't think I've ever suffered from dwarfism." And it's that exact same concept. Like, look at all the things I've been able to do, or it really hasn't limited me, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So when he said that, it's the exact same thing. Like, his word was suffer instead of disaster, right? But no, I haven't really suffered, which was pretty powerful when I heard him say that.
Imposters just the same.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Don't be too proud and don't be too crushed.
Right.
If you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools. So, I mean, I would say this is a little bit more of a niche point. But basically, sometimes you do your best to tell somebody, how things are, and then they take your words and they twist it when they, pass it along. And sometimes your good intentions can be twisted by others to make a trap for other people, right? I mean, I don't know. I think that's one of the lesser relatable phrases in this poem, but
well, it's interesting. It's very applicable to more our generation of how things work on social media now, where you're painted with or someone says something about you and then it ends up on the news. Even for some of our peers that may have more play in the media, we could see the recently the NHL guys, right? Like you're shown on now over the whole world in the palm of your hand and twisted in one way or another, and I think the media is a huge one.
Yeah, it's true. That whole soundbite thing where somebody, throw a sentence from somebody and then twist it and then make them
exactly. And that used to be just bigger. Well, I put it in quotations, bigger name people in the media, but now technically we are all in the media if you're involved in social media. Right. So now, this person said this, but we posted this picture, right. And you have to kind of. I don't want eat it isn't the word. That's maybe the word I would use around my peers in a different, but you almost have to now accept that.
Yeah.
And have that positive attitude that allows you to deal with that situation where you're negatively portrayed.
Right.
And say, well, I've got a bigger attitude. I'm bigger than this.
Right.
Right.
Right. Next.
Yep. Or watch the things you gave your life. Wait a second. Or to watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn out tools.
Playing the long game. It's all about, talk about a good attitude. That's literally talking about like everything you work for watch it get broken, and then, bend down, pick up your worn out tools, and rebuild from the beginning. Most people get fired at some point in their life and lose their job, right? That's a great example of this. It's like, hey, you work towards everything you had in that job, maybe a couple promotions, all the rest, and now market circumstances changed, or you got a new boss that brought about some change within your team and you got fired. Have the humility to stoop down, get your resume out, dust it off, pick it up, and move forward.
The interesting thing with that too is I know people that have been through scenarios like that, and the effect you have on people the effect those people have on people is incredible. Like they'll say, let's say you, for example, look at Ian, just got fired from his job and he's already out, started a little company, and he doesn't even care. He's just fired up the next day and he's back to doing something like that.
Yeah. And
people don't usually come out and say that because they're afraid to say, hey, sorry you got fired, this is really cool what you're doing. Right. People are afraid to come out and say that to people. And I know many people that have been kicked off their horse and they're down on the ground and they're already doing something to get back up on that horse. To me, that's one of the most empowering things, is that initial week or a day after something bad happens, or when someone is like, the thing I found, going back to the social media issue, the conversation those young hockey players had in the cab that was released by the Uber driver and has caused those people a bunch of issues. The way Matt Duchene dealt with that in the media the next day, 40 microphones in his face. Hey, you were caught talking poorly about your assistant coach. The way he dealt with that, to me, was one of the most incredible things. Like
remind people what he said.
Well, he was just saying that his coach was, his coach wasn't fit for the job, kind of thing was the general message, and they weren't using derogatory.
No, sorry. I mean, what did he say when he was talking to the journalists about it?
Oh, he just said, you know what, it was an unfortunate situation. We really appreciate our coach. We're all frustrated, and that was a way of us getting our frustration out. Was talking negatively about. I wouldn't even say leaders. I would just say someone on the team.
Right.
'Cause in the hockey world, your coach, your player, you're all in it together.
Right.
And I know he's an individual that would agree with that as well. And
right.
And he just took it. He took it on. Yeah, we said that. We are frustrated. We shouldn't have said it. He's a great coach. And then they went out the next night and won 7-4 or something like that. And it was just total acceptance for the situation. It was that humility. It was, and that empowered me.
Right.
And it's that effect that can have on people when you do get knocked off your horse, and the next day doing something with that proper attitude. And who knows what he does that he already had that attitude in him. It's just pretty impressive.
It's such a interesting way that this is written too, because just 2 lines above it was the triumph and disaster and treating those 2 imposters just the same. And then when you have everything you gave your life to broken, you stoop down and build back up. It's like, well, that's basically taking a good attitude and not really seeing it as disaster necessarily.
Right.
Like, I haven't been fired yet, but I'm hoping that if and when that time comes, I'll have the attitude to be able to do that. I mean, easier said than done, but
totally,
it's a good reminder.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah. If you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss. I mean, this is one where I don't agree. It's basically saying be totally willing to give everything up and risk everything. I think I get the point. It's that no risk, no reward in life, and you can't. And any semblance of safety is usually an illusion. You're not safe in this life, and life has 100% mortality rate. So you got to take some risks. That's all I really take from it, because I don't actually think he's suggesting you risk everything on one pitch and toss.
I would even see it as all the messages we've already learned. If you can embody all that, you're probably more likely to come out well on the other side, risking it all, if in fact you lose it, because you have all those qualities that allow you to lose everything and get back up.
Well, right. That's the whole point of the attitude thing. Is that, look, it's the thing that sustains you across varying life circumstances.
Right.
So, next.
And lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss. That's tough. Like I get it, but that situation's tough. That's why me. Look what happened to me. I like your Audi. I don't drive a car as nice as yours because of this, and complaining about. Yeah. Like, that's a tough situation.
Yeah, it is, and it's resolve, and it's a good attitude. Again, I mean, are you more likely to talk about and sort of complain about your loss when you're in a good headspace?
No. You're also probably not, I find this is comparing too.
Yeah.
Comparing to your neighbor.
Well, for sure.
Which is totally, I lost.
I got it worse than you.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a race to the bottom. And really, again, if you're in a good state of mind and good attitude and all the rest, you might not even conceive of it as a loss. You might not even think of it that way. You might think of it as an opportunity, because certainly, as James would write, that's what the healthy-minded individual would do. Now, we know when things get tough, you know, the attitude and all that gets tested, and it's a very conscious choice that you can change your attitude, like we said. So I don't want to make light of whatever, you know, people are going through or anything and say, hey, it's just you have an attitude problem. But I am trying to say there's a choice. There's always a choice on how you respond.
Right.
And that's not just, you know, 2018 Ian Bigford sitting here saying that. That's Viktor Frankl's conclusion coming out of Auschwitz, was that you always had a choice on how you would respond to what's happening to you. Next line, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone. So again, that's basically a call to delay gratification. So that's all about if you can force everything that you are. So the word sinew, Shakespeare used a lot. It's a word that literally means tendons and ligaments, the things that hold you together. And so this line, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew, what that's referring to is everything that's within you, whether it be your will, your heart, however you want to conceptualize that. If you can force that to continually step up to the plate and do what's necessary for those long-term benefits, that's worth doing. And he says that by saying to serve your turn long after they are gone. So that's basically saying have an impact beyond your life, beyond yourself. And we see that when you're working for your family and you're trying to invest for the future of your family. Maybe you're trying to, you know, put away some college fund or something like that. You know, that's an example of what he's talking about here.
Right.
It's just a general. We know, you know, it's just a general call for forcing yourself to sacrifice. A little bit, right? And again, there's a dichotomy in that line versus, you know, what he said where you have to, you know, try to enjoy your time here. It's not all about making dreams your master.
Dream, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So again, I wrote in this post at the top, you can spend so much time analyzing this thing.
And relating it to different parts of your life or other people's lives. Like, it's so relevant.
And so I would say it's also worth reading at different times in your life, because every time you go through something, you're a different person reading it.
Right. And you'd have other experiences that you can say, it almost makes you self-reflect and say, oh, I remember when I made this decision that I should or shouldn't have.
Right.
And this is a reasoning of why I did or didn't do that.
Right.
Next line. And so to hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. When there's, I guess, going back to the job loss situation, maybe you lost your third job. And it's like, why am I even going back into the corporate world, or why am I even trying to get my own startup if none of them keep working?
And even a microcosm of that, sorry to interrupt, was if anything, that's the will to hold on to your attitude.
Right.
When you get frustrated, when you get, you know, when bad things happen, and it could be in a situation where somebody's just not hearing you, or you're in an argument, or, you know, you feel your emotions starting to boil up. It's that will that's willing to say, hold on. You know, there are some great stories. I like reading war history because I think it's just like life, but it's amplified, and because it's life and death, right? Whereas in our daily lives, we're often a little bit far removed from that. I would say it might be a generous way to put it. So you see these decisions in people, prisoner of wars, for instance, where they can literally choose to just let go and die. Mm-hmm. But many of them write about this experience of the last little part of their self-preservation, saying, hold on.
Right. It's funny because people will say, what kept you going when, and I'm just going back to my story, and I'm not relating that to war by any stretch, or anything else. It's not a comparison piece. It's trying to find why I kept working out for 2 years and believing I was going to play quote unquote holding on when there was absolutely no reason to, and I was actually literally being told not to by many people.
Right.
And I wonder if that holding on is, like you said, is that attitude beforehand that I had curated from just experiences in my life that gave me the ability to hold on. And right or wrong, there was still, was that attitude that allowed me to hold on.
I'd say so. I mean,
that's interesting. Again, just relating it to your own, yourself, you can find reasons or areas in your life where it's like, I understand why.
Yeah, that attitude helped me, or hey, I could have had a better one.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Right. Totally.
So next line. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch. I mean, that goes back to what he was saying about not talking too wise a little bit. You don't want to talk down to people if you're,
That's a couple guests we've had. I mean, look at a few of the successful guests we've had that, the neurosurgeon and farmer and NHL players and successful startup tech individuals that we've had on the podcast, and they talk to me as if we're talking to anyone else, and they're totally...
You talk to Scheif for like 2 seconds, you'd have no idea that he's one of the top performers in the NHL. He's just like a totally normal guy, lots of common touch, yet he's walking around with using this poem's terms, he's walking around with kings in the sport. Mm-hmm. So he's playing with Crosby, he's playing with legends, but you wouldn't know it talking to the guy.
Right.
There's real virtue in that. We know the other side of that, which is the first line. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, it's like, well, okay, there's also this herding effect where you're with the common folk and they have their common opinion, but you got to remember what's within you and your virtues, as they put it here, or what you're trying to do, what you're aiming at, right? I shouldn't say we've all been on teams, but I've been in work situations where I'm on a team where they resent management like quite a bit, and so the common touch in that circumstance is screw it, who cares? And it's like, okay, but if you have a good attitude, it's like, well, like my work might not be noticed, it might not be valuable, we might be told to dig a hole and then fill it the next day. No problem. All right. Well, I'm just going to take a good attitude and do what I'm told, and hopefully have the best outcome I can possibly have on this team. So that's might not be the best example, but that's an example of where the crowd will do one thing, and you gotta reflect on what do I want.
Right.
So next line.
If neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much.
That's remaining a little detached. Right, it's never allowing yourself to be completely swept away by good or bad, and again that goes back to earlier in the poem, but basically saying that, look, if neither your foes, which we all intuitively know have the capacity of hurting you, but also it's often our loved ones that hurt us the most. If neither of those can hurt you, and if all men go with you but none too much, it's basically, hey, you know what, it's great to have my friends and my family around, and I love having them around, but I'm okay if I need to be on my own. Mm-hmm. I'm okay with I'm okay if they act out in a bad way. So I think it's kind of getting at just you don't want to be like detached and completely cold. That's not what it's saying. It's saying just, hey, be a little bit detached. We all, your loved ones will act out and act weird at different times, and hey, that's no factor. That's okay. And yeah, that's what I'd say about that line.
I think it makes me think you almost don't want to get used to or reliant on a certain relationship or situation with someone, and I give this, I get this in return. If you get used to that or relying on that, as soon as it's different, you're like, wait a second, what's going on? Usually when I'm nice to this person, they're nice to me, and now I'm thrown off. But if you don't get too reliant on that, it's okay, I understand this person might act different this time, I'm going to be nice to them, they're not nice to me, okay, I saw that coming, or I knew it was a possibility, let's just keep going. Again,
it's just an outgrowth of a good attitude again.
Yeah,
right. It's
exactly.
It's like, hey, I don't need the external circumstance to determine how I'm feeling. So I think with that, we're going to move on to the closing 4 lines, which I can read out. And they're perhaps the most badass lines of the entire poem.
Let's do it.
Perhaps. So here's how it goes. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you will be a man, my son. Now, I mean, he wrote it to his son, so that's important to notice, but think about that for a second. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run. I read that every time. I let that sink in. It's like, oh, geez, how many times am I letting a minute tick by and maybe getting 10 seconds in of distance run, right? It's a little section on focus. It's a little section on one thing at a time. It's a little section on continuous movement, right? That doesn't mean rushing. But it's basically saying, hey, if you keep moving forward, eventually the earth is yours, as he puts it, right? You'll have what you need. So,
and all those things we talked about, you can, if you really have all these, if you believe and can embody the messages in this poem, you can fill those minutes with a full 60 seconds of focus, of resiliency, of adaptability, of the terms that always come up on this podcast and 100%. In the episodes we've had. You will fill those.
Well, partially because of what we talked about before. You get out of your own way. You get out of your own psychological hang-ups and whatever. You just take a good attitude and you move forward. It's simple as that, right? And sort of removing the ego from the equation, and just, there's different ways you can put this point. Another way of putting it might be no hurry, no pause, but keep moving. But I totally agree. It's like if you're rushing around, if you're stressy, if you're, have some sort of neurosis, or you're kind of acting neurotically or
highly volatile, whatever,
emotionally unstable. I mean, those are all signals that, you might want to consider how you're conceptualizing what's around you. Are you thinking about what's grateful? Are you considering that on a daily basis? Are you thinking about, the people that you're lucky to be surrounded by? Are you thinking about what you can make happen if only you act out the behaviors that you need to accomplish your goals? And
is your goal clearly defined?
Is it clearly defined?
Is your original position even clearly defined?
Right. And is it a goal that's outside of yourself, meaning that you're not trying to work towards being some sort of character that you've invented in your mind, some sort of identity of like, I'm going to be courageous, I'm going to be... You notice that in this poem, right? It's like there's nothing about that kind of character virtue stuff in here. It's not like, well, it's about being truthful. It's about having discipline. It's about being courageous. It's about loving. It literally does not use any of those adjectives, and it talks specifically in a very poetic way, obviously, and beautiful way, about the experience of being this person, of having this attitude. And like we talked about, it's I think this ties in. What's interesting too is right around the time this poem was written was when William James posted his last book on this topic. I think so this poem was written in 1910. I think James posted his last book 8 years prior. So and that hit America like a sledgehammer. It was all over the place. It was all over the news. It was in all the papers. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some of that's been weaved into this poem as well, because this was written by American soldiers. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, let's finish with that same 4 lines. So when someone's listening to this, they're just like me right now reading this poem, as you're ready to jump up and get what needs to be done. So today you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run. The earth is yours and everything that's in it, which is more, you are a man or a woman ready for success. Nice. Good stuff. That brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed part 1 and part 2 and are able to reflect on that poem. Again, it's on the Mind Manual. Link is in the description of this episode. I hope you continue to check out those blogs. Ian puts a lot of work into them and breaks down some pretty life-changing and empowering ideas. So I encourage you to keep checking that out. I'm Ben Finelli. This is the Heroic Minds Podcast. We'll talk again soon.